Medieval peasant revolts are commonly thought of as pointless rebellions against an uncaring nobility and monarchy that never ended up changing anything for the common folk. But what if this couldn't be further from the truth? What if there were revolts so big and bad that they changed the course of history forever? Well, buckle up, because today we're going to go through some medieval revolts that really made a difference. And you won't believe how much blood, sweat, and tears went into these changes. And kicking off the list, we have the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. This revolt is one of the most famous in English history, although it doesn't get nearly enough attention when talking about medieval peasant revolts. You see, the 14th century was a hard time to be alive. The Black Death had swept through Europe and killed millions, including England. This meant that there was a labor shortage and peasants demanded better wages. However, the English Parliament passed the 1381 Statute of Labourers, which capped wages at pre-plague levels. So naturally, the peasants got pissed. And then things started to go from bad to worse when the poll tax was extended to peasants. This was a tax that only applied to the lower classes and had previously been used to fund wars. Now it was going to fund King Edward III's lavish lifestyle. So naturally, the peasants decided they just couldn't take it anymore. And with the help of the 16-year-old King Richard, who took advantage of the chaos to try and steal the throne, the peasants rebelled. They rampaged across the countryside and executed many nobles before being defeated by King Edward III. In the end, the statute was repealed, but the grievances of the peasants were largely ignored. But still, this was a huge deal. It showed that even the king could not defy the will of the people. Next up, we have the Jacquerie. This French revolt is one of the largest in French history and has inspired many works of art throughout the centuries. It all started when the French nobility and monarchy imposed heavy taxes on the peasantry to fund their extravagant lifestyles and endless wars. In response, the peasants launched a rebellion that saw them fight against the nobility and even storm the Bastille prison. However, the rebellion was eventually crushed, and many of the leaders were executed. But this didn't stop the Jacquerie from being remembered as one of the greatest peasant revolts in French history. And it also led to some reforms being implemented to make sure such a revolt would never happen again. Moving to Italy, we have the Sicilian Vespers. These events were a major turning point in Italian history, and they almost led to Sicily seceding from the Kingdom of Naples. It all started when the Angevins, who ruled the kingdom, tried to impose new taxes on the Sicilian nobility. This led to the Sicilians rising up and killing every Angevin noble they could find in what became known as the Sicilian Vespers. The rebels then invited Charles of Durazzo to become their new king, but he refused and instead sided with the Angevins. This led to years of fighting between the Sicilians and the Angevins until the latter were finally victorious. But this revolt showed that the Italian kingdoms were not as stable as they seemed, and that the people had a lot of power. Now let's move over to Germany and talk about the German Peasants' War. This was one of the deadliest conflicts in German history, and it saw the peasants rise up against the nobility and clergy. It all started when the peasants grew tired of the oppressive rule of the HRE and its nobility. They wanted more rights and freedoms, but the HRE was unwilling to give them any. This led to the German Peasants' War, which was one of the bloodiest conflicts in German history. Over 100,000 peasants were killed in this war, but it did lead to some positive changes. For example, it ended the feudal system in Germany and led to the introduction of serfdom. It also showed that the peasants were a powerful force to be reckoned with and that the nobility could not oppress them without facing serious consequences. Next up, we have the English Revolt of 1215. This revolt is significant because it led to the signing of the Magna Carta, a document that limited the power of the English king and is considered to be one of the foundations of modern democracy. The revolt began when King John attempted to raise taxes on the English nobility. They refused and launched a rebellion that forced King John to flee. He was eventually forced to sign the Magna Carta, which limited his power and gave the English nobility more rights. This revolt showed that even the English king was not above the law, and that the nobility had the power to hold him accountable. It also paved the way for future democratic reforms in England. Moving on, we have the Hussite Revolution. This revolution was a major turning point in Czech history, and it led to the establishment of the Hussite Church, which later became the dominant religion in the Czech lands. The revolution began when Jan Hus, a Czech reformer, was burned at the stake for criticizing the Catholic Church. His followers, known as the Hussites, revolted against the authorities and established a new church that was based on Hus's teachings. This revolution showed that the people had the power to challenge the authority of the church and state, and that religious reform was possible even in the most oppressive of regimes. Next up, we have the Ciompi Revolt. This revolt is an important part of Italian history, and it shows the power of the merchant class in the Italian city-states. The revolt began when the Ciompi, a guild of wool workers in Florence, grew tired of being oppressed by the wealthier merchants. They launched a rebellion that saw them seize control of Florence and institute a number of reforms that benefited the working class. This revolt showed that the merchant class was not as powerless as they were often portrayed, and that they could fight back against the nobility and win. Moving on, we have the Revolt of the Comuneros. This was a Spanish revolt that aimed to limit the power of the monarchy and establish a representative government. The revolt began when the Spanish nobility and clergy grew tired of the absolutist policies of King Henry IV. They launched a rebellion that saw them fight against the king's forces, but it was eventually crushed. Despite its failure, the Revolt of the Comuneros is an important part of Spanish history, as it showed the desire for political reform even in the most oppressive of monarchies. It also inspired later Spanish republicans and helped pave the way for the eventual establishment of democracy in Spain. Finally, we have the St. George's Day Uprising. This uprising was a major event in English history, and it led to the establishment of the English Parliament. The uprising began when the English barons grew tired of the oppressive rule of King Stephen. They launched a rebellion that forced Stephen to flee and led to the creation of a council of nobles known as the English Parliament. This uprising showed that the English king was not above the law, and that the nobility had the power to hold him accountable. It also laid the foundation for the development of English democracy. So there you have it, 7 medieval peasant revolts that changed history forever. From the English Peasants Revolt of 1381 to the St. George's Day Uprising, these revolts show that the people have the power to shape their own destiny, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Each of these revolts was unique in its causes and consequences, but they all share a common theme: the struggle for power and the desire for a better life. These revolts may have taken place centuries ago, but their lessons are still relevant today. They remind us that we should never give up the fight for justice and equality, and that we should always strive to create a better world for ourselves and our future generations. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please consider leaving a like or even subscribing. Your support would mean the world to me. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.